So welcome back to a new program of A Legacy to Defend. My name is Sister Miriam, and today we're going to begin a new mini-series of programs in which we're going to begin to talk about a specific church document. And the document that we're going to be looking at in this next series of programs is Dignitatis humanae. Dignitatis humanae, if you were to go onto the Vatican website and look it up, the title is Dignitatis humanae, and it's a declaration on religious freedom. And the subtitle that kind of comes underneath that is On the Right of the Person and of Communities to Social and Civil Freedom in Matters Religious, in Religious Matters. And it was promulgated in the year 1965. This is one of the documents that came out of Vatican II. But before we get into that, I'm going to give you a brief explanation as to why this document. And it really all began right at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, or even right before that all started. I received an email from a young lady that we know who's studying in the university, and she is in a Catholic university studying Catholic things, and they were given an essay to write. And the essay was, can religious freedom and Jesus' command to evangelize the whole world be reconciled? Can we affirm religious freedom and at the same time say that Jesus has given us a command to evangelize the whole world? And she wrote us this email asking for help because her teacher had basically given them to understand that that you can defend either position. That you can say, well, yes, they can be reconciled, or no, they can't be reconciled. And according to how you argue, they're both right. And so she wrote us asking for help, just looking for different documents, church documents or different sources to shed some light on this situation. And we wrote back to her, and we sent her this document, and it was shortly after that we decided to start doing these programs. And so we decided to start with this program. And I think it was very providential because I said it before, it was at the very, very beginning of the coronavirus. And I think that it probably depends on what country you're in, but I think in almost all of the countries we've come to realize that there seems to be some kind of agenda behind all of this. And in many of the countries, the state is actually beginning to infringe upon the religious freedom of the Catholics living in those countries. Just an example, over in Spain, I know it's happened in France as well, there's been other cases in other places of religious ceremonies going on, mass going on, and the police coming into the church where the mass is going on. And even though everyone is following the rules, social distancing, everyone's keeping their space, masks and gloves, whatever has been stipulated on a state law, everything was being followed very carefully, but it didn't matter. Right? The police came in and they ordered them to leave the church. Didn't matter that they were in the middle of mass, they just had to leave. The priest could continue by himself, but the people had to leave. And so we're beginning to see in certain areas, more than others, that there is this certain infringement upon religious freedom. And so that's why I think it's also providential that we begin with this document just so that we have a clear idea of what the church says about religious freedom. What are our rights? How do we defend it? Where does it come from? How can I explain this to someone else who doesn't know anything about it? So we're going to begin with the document Dignitatis humanae. What I didn't know when this young lady wrote us this email, and what I didn't know when we chose this document to begin with these programs, was that it is one of the most controversial documents of the Vatican II Council. So what we're going to do in this first program, it's kind of going to be an introduction into this document. We're just going to go over the story behind the document, why there's a controversy, the historical context of that controversy, and then how to understand that. And that will lead us straight into what we're going to begin to talk about as we go through the different points of the document. Very good. So, the first thing, there's a controversy. Did you know there was a controversy about this document? I didn't know until we started to investigate it more. later, I realized that it is something that we had seen in one of our classes on church history, but not specifically speaking about this document. So what does the controversy consist of? Basically, what we're going to see is that all of the magisterium previous to Pope John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council actually condemns the idea of religious freedom. Right? It's very important. What we're going to see is that they're condemning an idea that it's not what you have in mind when you think of religious freedom. So they're going to condemn that. And then in Dignitatis humanae, they're actually going to promulgate the right to religious freedom for all people. Right? So this is the controversy. We're going to go through it point by point just to see what exactly did the previous magisterium say, and then how do we understand that apparent controversy, right? That's important, right? Apparent contradiction. Okay, so it's important to understand that the reflection on religious freedom, explicit reflection on religious freedom, didn't really begin until the 18th century, until the 1700s. And in the second part of this program today, we're going to get into the historical context of all that, so it will help us to understand. But to begin at the beginning, previous magisterium. If we go back to 1832, right, Gregory the 16th, Pope Gregory the 16th, wrote an encyclical called Mirari Vos, and it's on liberalism and religious indifferentism. And this is what he says. This shameful font of indifferentism gives rise to that absurd and erroneous proposition which claims that liberty of conscience must be maintained for everyone. It spreads ruin in sacred and civil affairs, though some repeat over and over again with the greatest impudence that some advantage accrues to religion from it, right? So this is Pope Gregory the 16th in an encyclical, right? This is magisterium. And we have him here saying that liberty of conscience is an absurd and erroneous proposition, and that it spreads ruin in sacred and civil affairs. Okay? Great. Next step. That's 1832. In 1848, Pope Leo XII, in another encyclical, Ubi Primum, is going to say, a certain sect, which you surely know, has unjustly arrogated to itself the name of philosophy, and has aroused from the ashes the disorderly ranks of practically every error. Under the gentle appearance of piety and liberality, this sect professes what they call tolerance or indifferentism. It preaches that not only in civil affairs, which is not our concern here, but also in religion, God has given every individual a wide freedom to embrace and adopt without danger to his salvation whatever sect or opinion appeals to him on the basis of his private judgment. Right? Long sentence, what is he saying? He's just saying that he's condemning tolerance and indifferentism. And he's defining this idea as what he says, the widespread idea, the wide freedom to embrace whatever religion you want without danger to your own salvation, right? This is what they're condemning. We're going to see later on, but it's important that we repeat it, I think, through the entire program so that it stays clear. What we're going to see is that they're condemning what nowadays would be known as religious pluralism. Religious pluralism or indifferentism or religious tolerance understood in a very specific way. Nowadays, that's not what we refer to when we talk about religious freedom. But we're going to keep going with this first. Blessed Pius IX, right, in Quanta Cura, that's in 1864. It's an encyclical condemning current errors. He is just going to, between Quanta Cura and the syllabus, it's his entire list of modern errors that he condemns. It would be worth reading, but we're just going to quote a small part of it. He says, they do not fear to foster that erroneous opinion, most fatal in its effects on the Catholic Church and the salvation of souls, called by a predecessor, Gregory the 16th, we've already read from him, an insanity. That liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right, which ought to be legally proclaimed and asserted in every rightly constituted society, and that a right resides in the citizens to an absolute liberty, which should be restrained by no authority, whether ecclesiastical or civil. Right? So he is actually referring to insanity as the idea that liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right. Right? For us nowadays to hear this, it sounds like this isn't coming from a church document. It sounds like it doesn't make sense. Right? So there is an apparent contradiction that we have to understand in order to understand Dignitatis Humanae. This was in 1864. In 1963, Pope John the 23rd is kind of going to give, he's the first one who kind of changes the explicit terminology here. And he is going to write an encyclical called Promulgated on establishing universal peace in truth, justice, charity, and liberty. And he is going to say, also among man's rights is that of being able to worship God in accordance with the right dictates of his own conscience, and to profess his religion both in private and in public. This is going to start to sound more familiar to us nowadays in our own mentality, in what we've kind of grown up in especially in the West, when we think about human rights, liberalism, democracy, all of that. It's very familiar to us that man has a right to worship God in accordance with the right dictates of his own conscience, right? But when John the 23rd published this, there was a large sector of the church that was totally taken aback because they thought that he was breaking entirely with the previous church tradition. Because as we've just seen in the other 3 documents, they speak very clearly against religious freedom. They're understanding something different, right? And it's easier for us nowadays from our mentality to recognize that there's something different there. But especially when John the 23rd published this encyclical, and then later when Dignitatis Humanae was written, it was still in the midst of that change of mentality and really going down into details to understand the differences here. So Dignitatis Humanae, 2 years after John the 23rd published Promulgated, the Second Vatican Council, 1965, this document was published, is going to say in number 2 of Dignitatis Humanae, it's going to declare that the human person has a right to religious freedom, right? Ecumenical Council, Magisterium. How do we reconcile that statement with everything that's come beforehand? And it's very important that this doesn't scare us. As Catholics, we know that the Holy Spirit is helping us. We know that the Holy Spirit is guiding the Pope, he's guiding the Magisterium, he's guiding the correct interpretation of the revelation of the deposit of faith that Jesus gave to the apostles. So things that might in moments appear as contradictory, we have to have the courage to actually seek to understand what's going on, because our faith is never going to be contradictory to reason. It's never going to be irrational. And for people who don't want to recognize the truth inside of the faith, they're going to take advantage of these apparent contradictions to say things like this, right? Based on looking at this, that means the church can change her teaching. That means we can start to talk again about women becoming priests, about giving Holy Communion to people in mortal sin, and we can talk about getting rid of celibacy for the priests, right? All of this they're things that we're seeing nowadays because there's people who don't understand, some who legitimately don't understand because they've never received that formation. Others who don't understand it because they don't want to see it, because what they want to do is change things, right? We have to embrace the magisterium of the church and seek to understand it and follow in tradition what the Lord has handed down to us since the very beginning, right? So that's the controversy. That's the controversy behind this document. And now what we're going to look at is the historical context, because we have to understand what was going on historically in each of those moments to understand really why the popes spoke in that way and with the language that they did. Okay, so the historical context, we're going to see very briefly, going back to the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, and everything that happened immediately afterwards, especially in the 17th century, and especially in Europe Europe was racked with what are known as the wars of religion. And the wars of religion were basically wars between Protestants and Catholics, or different sects of Protestantism and Catholics. And this is something, as we begin to talk about the historical aspect of this, we have to take a step back from our modern mentality and recognize that all of us kind of are like byproducts of our time. Right? We think in a certain way because this is what we've grown up in. And the culture nowadays is very different than things back in the 17th century. In the 17th century, Europe is united and all of Europe is Catholic. And there is a strict union between church and state. A strict union between church and state, which for us nowadays sounds almost absurd. To not have a separation of church and state for us seems like someone must be infringing upon someone else's rights. It just has to be that way. But for them, it was entirely normal to have the church and the state united together. And obviously, as a human person, I mean, it makes sense as well in the sense that we're all on a journey together towards heaven. And church and state, in an ideal situation, all of that is helping us to get there, all of it. But in the wars of religion, basically, Europe is going to be torn apart. There was a lot of political reasons going on behind these wars, but it ended up being between Protestants and Catholics, at least on a name basis. And so some people are going to say at the end of this that religion is dangerous. Religion is dangerous. The religion is the cause of war that has divided Europe. We need to get rid of religion. And that's when they begin to talk about religious freedom and a right to religious freedom. But especially in the beginning here, when they talk about religious freedom, what they propose is not freedom to follow one's conscience, which is what we probably understand nowadays as freedom of religion. What they're proposing is religious pluralism. They're saying, I am free to choose the religion I want, because in the end, it's indifferent. There is no truth. There is no true religion. These wars have proven that. And now we have to say that we have the right to choose whatever religion we want with absolutely no consequences. And this really is a fruit of a lot of the philosophy that was going on at the time as well. But it's clear that the popes had to oppose this type of this way of understanding religious freedom, and it's something that's still condemned by the church today. The church continues to condemn religious pluralism or religious indifferentism, saying that there is no path, like certain path to salvation. Right? What happens after this? Shortly after this, the second half of the 18th century, is when liberalism emerges. And liberalism, especially in the as a result of the North American and the French revolutions, these revolutions are kind of referred to as the beginning of contemporary history. And they're more or less known for three things. More things as well, but these three things are what we're going to look at right now. They're known for bringing about democracy. They're known for bringing about a separation between church and state, and they're known for helping to establish constitutions that involve, for the first time, a list of human rights. And as I've named these things, I'm sure it sounds familiar to us, because this is the society that we're still living in today. Democracy, separation of church and state, and these are all my rights. All right, this makes sense to us. But liberalism is what brought this into play for the first time. But it's important to recognize as well, especially in Europe, that there was an entire agenda behind liberalism. This is what they would like us to see liberalism as, bringing about these three things that have done so much good for society. And they're not bad things. They're not bad things, and it's true that they have helped in certain aspects. But we can't turn a blind eye to the agenda that accompanied liberalism from the very beginning. And that was especially visible in the French Revolution and in the liberalism and the liberalism movements that kind of sprung up in Europe after that. Because in every one of those movements, there was a very strong persecution of the Catholic Church, because liberalism was born together with a desire to dismantle and to eliminate the Catholic Church, right, in its origin, right, and that's something that can be recognized historically. So ever since the Protestant Reformation, the union in Europe is broken, liberalism has introduced the ideas of democracy, separation of church and state, and human rights. This is when the church is kind of faced with having to reflect upon as well the reality of the rights that are being asked to be recognized. And some of the rights that were being put forward is the right to religious freedom. But as we've said at the beginning, and as we're going to say again now, in that moment, religious freedom was understood as religious pluralism, religious indifferentism. There is no correct path to get to heaven. There is no correct path to salvation. Everything is legitimate. So give me freedom to choose. And the popes had to say several times, we can't give you freedom to choose, because what you're asking for, Pius IX actually refers to it as the liberty of perdition. You're asking for us to defend your liberty to be lost, to go to hell, to stray from the right path. And as pastor, as pope, I can't recognize that right. I can't tell you that this is okay. And this is what they were emphasizing at that moment. Historically speaking, following the rise of liberalism, especially in Europe, everything changes. The absolute monarchies are going to give way to new secular states in which the church is now separated from the state. And the church and the popes and the church doctrine has to go little by little, kind of seeking to understand, okay, what is the new role of the church? How do we understand everything that's going on? And this really is going to take us all the way up to the Second Vatican Council. When the popes talk about the need to examine the relationship between the church and the modern world, a lot of it is precisely because of the massive changes that have taken place. None of us have lived those changes. We've come after that, but it's necessary to recognize that this was going on. So how can we understand this apparent contradiction? Pope Benedict XVI is actually going to help us understand this. It's kind of tradition. It's kind of tradition for the popes to give an address or a discourse to the Roman Curia for Christmas. And so on the 22nd of December of 2005, Benedict XVI gave a talk to the Roman Curia precisely on the Second Vatican Council. And it would be worthwhile to go through this entire discourse, but we're really only going to take a very, very small section, which actually applies to our topic, because he places the example of religious freedom as one of the explicit examples to help to illustrate what the point that he's trying to get across. So this entire discourse is on how to understand the Second Vatican Council, because I think, as we mentioned at the beginning, some people have interpreted the Second Vatican Council as the council which broke with tradition, and they understand it as discontinuity or rupture. The Church has entirely abandoned everything that it taught previously. They just broke and started something new, and everything that's new should just be rejected. And Benedict XVI is going to explain how do we have to understand this. And his thesis, the point that he's trying to get across, is that in the midst of this apparent discontinuity or this apparent rupture in certain things, once the necessary distinctions have been made, we're going to discover that there is not a discontinuity, but rather a continuity of principles. And he's saying, in order to see this, in order to recognize that the principles have remained the same, we have to distinguish between two things, right? We have to distinguish between contingent matters and permanent principles. Okay, contingent matters. What does the word contingent mean? Contingent means something that is not necessary, something that is not permanent, something that is accidental. So when we examine what the Church has said in different moments, especially when they're talking about historical contingent matters, we have to be able to recognize where is the principle that is underlying these decisions and where is the contingent historical matter that is concrete right now, but precisely because it's contingent, it could change. And we have to be able to adapt with that and change things. Right? He says, quote, "We must learn to understand that the Church's decisions on contingent matter, things that are not permanent, things that are not necessary," and he says, for example, certain practical forms of liberalism should necessarily be contingent themselves, precisely because they refer to a specific reality that is changeable in itself. What does that mean? That just means that since practical forms of liberalism, right? On a political level, this government could be liberal, it could be a democracy, it could be an anarchy, it could be a whole number of things. Each one of those specific manifestations or realities is a contingent matter, right? It's a contingent situation. And so when the Church pronounces on something that is contingent, what the Church is saying is also contingent in what pertains to that specific form of things that can change. He said, "It was necessary to learn to recognize that in these decisions, it is only the principles that express the permanent aspect, since they remain as an undercurrent, motivating decisions from within." Right? So he's saying that what we have to do is look past the historical things that can change to the underlying principles that necessarily must be founded in divine revelation, in the deposit of the faith, in what Jesus himself revealed to us. And he gives us the specific example of religious freedom. And he says, thus, for example, if religious freedom were to be considered as an expression of the human inability to discover the truth and thus become a canonization of relativism, right? If people are asking us to say that religious freedom is okay, and what they understand by religious freedom is religious pluralism, relativism, religious indifferentism, if by religious freedom you understand any of these erroneous ways of understanding religious freedom, and what you're claiming is that man is incapable of knowing truth, that we can't know what the true path is, and therefore anything goes, well, we can't accept that. He says, "It is quite different, on the other hand, to perceive religious freedom as a need that derives from human coexistence, or indeed as an intrinsic consequence of the truth that cannot be externally imposed, but that the person must adopt only through the process of conviction." Right? So he's going to distinguish between what they understood at the moment as religious freedom, and that's why it was condemned, to what Dignitatis humanae is going to say, this is a right for every human person, because this is how it should be understood. Right? And this is what we're going to see as we begin to go through the actual document of Dignitatis humanae in the programs that follow. So please join us again for the next programs as we begin to actually go into the document itself. God bless.